9 incestuous marriages of medieval queens. The disturbing truth history tried to conceal. If siblings marry, the next generation carries an inbreeding coefficient of 25%, but 45.38%, a number nearly double that danger threshold, flowed through the veins of one of the ancient world's most powerful queens, a woman who once made the Roman Empire tremble. Behind the magnificent thrones lay suffocatingly closed marriage contracts. Uncles married nieces, brothers handed crowns to their biological sisters. No outside force could shake them. Yet, what ultimately brought down these dynasties was the very thing they guarded most fiercely. Tracing the genealogical puzzle pieces of these 9 women, you will encounter history's ultimate irony. And the cruelest cage was not forged by enemies, but cast from the very bloodline they believed to be pure. Section 1. Maria Antonia of Austria. To truly grasp the absolute devastation of this invisible cage, let us begin at the peak of European royal inbreeding. In 1669, amidst a bitter winter enveloping the majestic Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the birth of Princess Maria Antonia did not bring the roaring cheers one would expect for a dynasty at its zenith. The pristine snowflakes falling outside the magnificent stained glass windows seemed to carry a biting cold right into the delivery room. Instead of jubilation, her arrival was met with hidden sighs behind deep crimson velvet curtains. By the 17th century, the House of Habsburg had spread its roots across Europe, forging an empire upon which the sun never sets. But accompanying this unprecedented expansion of power was a genealogical structure that had ceased to grow into flourishing branches. Instead, it had coiled into a vicious, intertwined loop across dozens of generations. The royal physicians of the era, armed with only rudimentary medical knowledge, could not possibly comprehend concepts like genes or DNA. Yet, they could witness a heartbreaking reality unfolding day after day with their own naked eyes. The royal children being born were growing increasingly frail, pale, bearing severe deformities, and quietly slipping away before they could even grow up. Maria Antonia, a princess born into silk and velvet, I unwittingly carried an estimated inbreeding coefficient of 0.3053. To modern geneticists, even with a family tree that lacks absolute completion, this is a staggering figure. It surpasses the limits of even the closest direct relationships, such as parent and child. Let us peel back the layers of her family tree to understand where this suffocation originated. Her father, Emperor Leopold I, was simultaneously her mother's biological uncle and first cousin. Her maternal grandparents were also an uncle-niece pair. From one generation to the next, the Habsburg bloodline received absolutely no fresh vitality from the outside world. She walked through vast, candle-lit corridors, surrounded by the finest physicians on the continent. But the jewel-encrusted gowns could not hide the truth, and her body was failing from the inside out. Nature always harbors laws that absolute power can neither bend nor bribe. Maria Antonia's vitality was like a candle flickering in the wind. That flame wavered, then extinguished at the age of 23. Her passing in the most radiant years of her youth permanently severed a branch of the family tree, leaving a cold void within the grand palace. But Maria Antonia was not spontaneously born with this genetic burden. Standing behind her is the shadow of a mother whose fate was even more fleeting. But for now, to truly understand the root cause of why monarchs pushed themselves to the absolute limits of such cruelty, we must leave snow-covered Europe and travel back in time over 3,000 years back to the first civilization to sign these blood contracts. Section 2. Ankhesenamun, Egypt, 1350 BC. In November 1922, in the barren, scorching Valley of the Kings, where the Egyptian sun baked every limestone slab, archaeologist Howard Carter carefully chiseled a small hole into a stone door that had been sealed for 3 millennia. The scent of time, of embalming spices and thousands of years of dust billowed out. As the flickering candlelight pierced the darkness, he held his breath. Gleaming beneath the dust of ages were chariots, statues guarding the throne, and the solid gold death mask of the boy pharaoh, Tutankhamun. That discovery shook the world, elevating the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt to the pinnacle of glory in the eyes of posterity. But yet, behind the blinding aura of gold, few noticed one of the quietest and most tragic corners of the tomb. There, laid to rest humbly beside their powerful father, were 2 small, intricately carved coffins. Inside were the remains of 2 stillborn baby girls. Modern DNA and medical testing later confirmed the gender of these 2 short-lived seeds of life. Tiny souls who never opened their eyes to the world, never once breathing the air of the living. These 2 tiny figures were not merely the silent agony of a mother. They were the mute evidence of a dynasty driving itself into the abyss. Their mother was Queen Ankhesenamun. Born during a reign fraught with religious upheaval and political conspiracy, the young girl quickly became a pawn to consolidate the throne. And forensic science has unveiled a heartbreaking truth. According to a widely supported hypothesis, Ankhesenamun was highly likely not just the wife, but also the paternal half-sister of the young pharaoh. To the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh's blood was the blood of the gods, the sole thread connecting the mortal realm to the eternal world. Sharing that sacred bloodline with commoners outside the royal house was the ultimate taboo. To preserve this divine purity, they willingly entered into cyclical, interwoven contracts. Ankhesenamun ascended to the position of queen when she was barely in her mid-teens. The crown upon her head was heavy not just with jewels, but with the crushing consequences of generations of genetic accumulation. Her husband, her brother, Tutankhamun, possessed a fragile constitution with congenital foot deformities, relying on a cane to walk the temple corridors. And Ankhesenamun bore an even heavier burden, sustaining the survival of an entire empire from a gene pool that was utterly depleted of life force. The young girl's sorrow vanished amidst rigid royal rituals. No one recorded it. There was no blank space in the papyrus chronicles for the tears of a mother cradling a fetus whose heart had stopped beating. All that remains are 2 small coffins and 3,000 years of silence. Nature had drawn a cruel boundary that even those who called themselves gods could not cross. Those little souls were the final testament to a great dynasty destroying itself from within. The darkness closed over Tutankhamun's tomb, burying that dazzling empire along with it. Yet, history seems eternally afflicted with a disease of amnesia. Over 1,000 years later, on this very soil along the banks of the Nile, another queen would walk down the exact same disastrous path of closed tradition. Only her choice did not stem from faith or religion. It was a cold, calculating game of political chess. Section 3. Cleopatra VII. Under the blazing sun beating down on the white marble palaces of Alexandria, Cleopatra ascended the throne. History, viewed through the lens of literature and cinema, often paints her as a beauty immersed in romantic legends, a woman who used her allure to move mountains. However, and the truth behind the doors of the Ptolemaic royal palace left no room for sentimental weakness. 1st century BC Alexandria was the most dazzling city in the world. The greatest library humanity had ever known stood there. Ships laden with wheat and spices docked daily, and the pharaoh's lighthouse illuminated the night for merchants flocking from all corners of the globe. Amidst this brilliant prosperity, the Ptolemaic royal palace stood imposing, an island of power self-isolated from the rest of the world. Not out of weakness, but out of fear. They feared that one day, the bloodline they deemed supreme would be diluted by the unworthy. The Ptolemaic dynasty established a suffocatingly closed endogamous tradition to prevent power from falling into other hands. Cleopatra, an exceptional queen, you could not escape this orbit herself. She was forced into consecutive marriage contracts with her 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. In reality, these marriages masked bloody purges. Ptolemy XIII, her first younger brother, once allied with his advisors to exile Cleopatra herself from Egypt, forcing her into the harsh desert. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria and tipped the scales in Cleopatra's favor, the balance of power flipped in an instant. Ptolemy XIII vanished into the cold waters of the Nile. The second brother, Ptolemy XIV, sat on the throne as a puppet, and soon met his end under circumstances that history chose to record rather vaguely. These were not marriages of affection. They were life or death chess matches where the loser rarely walked away from the board. It must be clarified, however, these were strictly symbolic marriages, intended to legitimize co-rulership, not actual marital relations. In Cleopatra's world, the nominal spouse was also the most dangerous political rival, always waiting for an opportunity to strip her of power. Even so, the consequences of centuries of maintaining this closed tradition left a deep imprint on the Ptolemaic family tree. When geneticists turned back the pages of history, they were stunned by her estimated inbreeding coefficient of 45.38%. Although the dynasty's family tree still has blurry spots through the dust of time, 45.38% remains an extreme threshold, a number normally only seen in the most direct incestuous relationships. To put this into perspective, the inbreeding coefficient of a child born to typical full siblings is 25%. Cleopatra carried nearly double that threshold, not because of a single marriage, but because dozens of successive generations had carefully locked every door leading to the outside world. Because of the nominal nature of these marriages, she fortunately left no heirs with her 2 brothers. Her children carried half their blood from forces entirely alien to the dynasty, the Romans, and this very calculation inadvertently saved her children from the brutal genetic loop their ancestors had created. But the craving to lock down power through incestuous marriages never stopped in the ancient world. Leaving the Nile Valley, crossing a millennia and a half of history to head toward Central Europe, we will witness an even more absurd story. History will ask, when the throne speaks, does canon law even matter anymore? Section 4. Anna of Austria. Church bells tolled coldly against the 16th century Spanish sky. Princess Anna of Austria left her peaceful homeland, donning a magnificent royal gown to step into an aisle weighed down by arrangement. Waiting for her at the end of the red carpet was no stranger, but her own biological uncle, King Philip II. That year, Anna was about to turn 21. Prior to this, since she was 19, she had been betrothed to Don Carlos, her cousin and Philip's own son. Letters exchanged had sparked hope for a future for the young couple. But Don Carlos suddenly passed away, leaving Philip ruling a vast empire without a qualified male heir. Amidst a court full of calculation, Anna shifted from the intended bride of the son to the queen of the father. No one asked for her opinion, and no one cared about the tears hidden beneath her veil. This marriage posed a question no one in the palace dared to speak aloud. History recorded an ironic truth. Initially, the Vatican fiercely opposed such a relationship that went against all moral bounds. Yet, the battle between theocracy and monarchy did not last long. The sheer weight of the throne eventually bent canon law. When the throne speaks, even divine law seems to concede. This was not the first time Philip II had convinced the Vatican to approve such a union. The Habsburgs didn't see this as an exception, and they saw it as tradition. And a tradition, once named, is incredibly difficult to erase with just a letter from Rome. Becoming the mistress of the palace, Anna stepped into a gilded cage with a single mission: to secure the succession of the throne. That pressure rapidly drained the life from the young woman. Her body endured 5 pregnancies and births in a brutally short span of time. Despite the protection of fortified stone walls and the finest royal physicians in Europe, the cruelty of a closed gene pool began to speak. Out of the 5 children she bore from her own flesh, 4 vanished into the void, while their lives were far too short. Fernando, her first son, lived a mere 7 years. Little Carlos Lorenzo closed his eyes at just 2. The little Princess Maria also could not escape an early grave. Most agonizing of all was the loss of Diego, the one carrying the highest expectations, who departed this world at the age of 7. The vast corridors of the Madrid palace were filled with a bone-chilling silence from empty rooms and cold cradles. Only Philip, the 4th child, survived to later become King Philip III. The successive childbirths and unimaginable losses completely drained Anna's strength. She died in October 1580, amidst a deadly flu epidemic sweeping through the royal court, claiming the lives of servants and sovereigns alike. At the time, she was pregnant with her 6th child. She closed her eyes at 30, an age that should have been a woman's most radiant prime. Her absence left a lingering melancholy in the palace. But Anna's death did not awaken the Habsburg dynasty. On the contrary, it was merely the opening chapter to an even darker era, when this dynasty officially picked up the hammer and forged the shackles that would wrap tightly around the necks of future generations. Section 5. Mariana of Austria. Nearly a century after the tolling bells for Anna of Austria faded, the suffocating atmosphere of the Madrid royal palace witnessed an old script repeating itself. This time, the arrangement of the crown carried an even more bitterly ironic twist. The young girl Mariana was originally betrothed to her cousin, Prince Balthazar Charles, who held the title of Crown Prince of Spain. However, when the prince died suddenly, the dynasty immediately faced the peril of lacking an heir. Within the royal court, power never tolerates a vacuum. And so, at the age of 14, before she could even shape a clear future, Mariana had to cast aside her old plans, put on a heavy wedding dress, and quietly walk to the side of her late fiancé's father. That was King Philip IV, a man old enough to be her father, and who was also her biological uncle. Mariana grew up in Vienna, in a palace filled with music and art. Her father, Emperor Ferdinand III, was a renowned patron of the arts, commissioning the first Baroque music in Austrian history. In her memory, Austria was sun-drenched afternoons and spring gardens full of lilacs. Spain was dark, wood-paneled rooms, rigid ceremonies, and a strange man waiting on a throne. The journey from Vienna to Madrid took months. There are no records of the young girl's size during that long trek. But this time, the legacy of past generations was no longer hidden. It was starkly present on the face of the heir to the throne, King Carlos II, who ascended to the throne when he was not quite 4 years old. Genetic deformity was vividly etched onto the young king's face with the trademark Habsburg jaw. His lower jaw protruded to the point where his bite was completely misaligned. The Habsburg jaw had actually appeared many generations prior, but with each generation of inbreeding, this trait worsened. Carlos II, the endpoint of that interwoven chain, had possessed a jaw so severe that royal physicians noted he could not chew solid food until the end of his life. The Spanish king's meals had to be mashed before being served. The most basic functions of a normal human being, like eating or pronouncing words clearly, became a grueling ordeal. The entire Spanish court was plunged into tense silence for years, merely waiting for their king to take his first unsteady steps on his weak legs. An empire that once controlled a massive portion of the world had driven itself to its own demise without the need for any enemy, simply because Carlos could not leave behind a single heir. Carlos bore on his shoulders a body heavily laden with the cumulative consequences of many generations. But right inside that very cold palace, and he had a biological sister who never even had the chance to live that long. She had to pay her family's genetic debt with her own youth. Section 6. Margaret Teresa of Spain. If you have ever stood before the masterpiece Las Meninas by the great painter Velázquez, your eyes will undeniably be drawn to the little princess Margaret Teresa. The painting immortalizes the image of an innocent, radiant, blonde angel standing amidst a quiet royal room. Art froze her most brilliant moment. But the reality behind that canvas bore a much darker palette. The master Velázquez painted Margaret Teresa at least 5 times in her lifetime. Those portraits were not merely art. They were carefully packaged and sent via diplomatic channels to Vienna, where Emperor Leopold I was waiting to watch the growth of the bride appointed for him since she was in the cradle. The final portrait he managed to complete was when she was only 8 years old. Velázquez died in 1660, years before Margaret made the bridal journey from Madrid to Vienna. When she turned 15, the journey into marriage began. The clear, innocent eyes in those old paintings had yet to comprehend the colossal pressures waiting ahead. When she shed her childhood gowns to put on the royal robes of an empress, Margaret was bound to a marriage that defied all natural boundaries. The man waiting for her in Vienna, Emperor Leopold I, held a highly complex status. He was her biological uncle and simultaneously her cousin. Living in an era where the voice of a royal woman was merely an instrument to maintain the regime, Margaret obediently bowed to the throne's arrangement. According to surviving records of the era, the two shared a relatively warm relationship, bonding over a love for music and art. He called her Gretel, an affectionate German nickname, a rare drop of warmth in a marriage built entirely on a political foundation. Yet, no matter how warm the affection, it could not salvage the devastation of biology. That submission had to be paid for with her very life. Her youthful body was rapidly drained under the weight of 6 consecutive pregnancies packed into a mere 6 years. She gave birth to 4 children and endured at least 2 agonizing miscarriages. Of the 4 children born, as 3 could not hold on to the world for more than a few months. Fernando died at 6 months old. John Leopold closed his eyes on the day of his birth, and Maria Anna Josefa left this world after 2 weeks. The cold stone corridors of the Hofburg Palace witnessed the once radiant flower wither at a brutal pace. In March 1673, royal physicians noted her health was so exhausted that it was beyond recovery. The princess from the classic painting quietly closed her eyes, departing the world at the tender age of 21, taking with her a heavily ravaged body. Margaret left, leaving behind her ill-fated babies and only one surviving daughter. That child resiliently survived it all, but only to become the heir to a genetic inheritance no one would ever want. That was Maria Antonia, the queen who held the tragic record for the inbreeding coefficient, whom we encountered at the very beginning of this story. The passing of this mother and her children closed off a branch of the family tree. But in another kingdom, 1,000 miles from Vienna, that same beaten path was silently setting another trap. Not for the body, but for the mind. Section 7. Maria I of Portugal. Leaving the dark shadow of the Habsburgs, thousands of miles away from Austria, the Portuguese royal family was casting another genetic net. Queen Maria I ascended the throne with extraordinary governing abilities, recorded by history as a wise and enlightened monarch. Yet, that brilliant intellect still could not help her cast off her family customs. Maria I was the first reigning queen in Portuguese history. Strict laws of the time dictated that a female heir wishing to keep the throne must marry someone within the royal family, absolutely forbidding any foreign interference. The simplest solution the court could conceive: marry within the family. She nodded in agreement to marry her own biological uncle, a man 17 years her senior. This was a marriage heavily burdened with protecting the throne, where the title of husband and wife was merely a shell to guard power from prying eyes. The cycle did not stop there. The story of the House of Braganza grew even gloomier when her son, Crown Prince José, went on to choose Benedita, his biological aunt, 15 years his senior, as his life partner. See, if the Habsburgs had to endure agonizing physical scars, the closed interbreeding in Portugal silently eroded something far more intangible: the tranquility of the mind. Maria's burden did not just come from her bloodline. In 1786, she lost her husband and uncle. Before the pain could subside, 2 years later, her most beloved son, Crown Prince José, died of smallpox at the age of 27. The blows of fate, from the death of her confessor to the news of the bloody French Revolution overthrowing the monarchy next door, struck relentlessly. For a queen who already possessed a sensitive genetic structure, these were fatal blows. The glorious years of Queen Maria were gradually obscured by a dark veil. In her final years, people only saw the phantom of the queen wandering alone in the vast, windy corridors of the Cleopatra palace. Sometimes she screamed in the night, sobbing uncontrollably without anyone knowing why. Sometimes she would fall completely silent for days on end. In 1792, the court officially declared her unfit to rule. When Napoleon's army advanced into Portuguese territory, the royal family had to evacuate urgently to Brazil. They ushered Maria onto a ship in the dead of night, bringing along a body entirely lost in the fog of her own mind, completely detached from the reality moving outside. If you lived in that era, would you choose to protect the throne at all costs, or trade it for a child's right to grow up and grow old normally? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Because right after this, we will meet a queen who appeared entirely healthy on the outside. Yet, coursing through her veins was something that all of Europe would pay the price for over the decades to come. Section 8. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. The whistle of steam trains and the pounding of hammers tearing through the fog of the Industrial Revolution marked an unprecedented era of glory for the British Empire. Queen Victoria ascended the throne, ushering in an era bearing her own name. In 1840, she donned a pristine white wedding dress and walked down the aisle with Prince Albert. Historical facts record them as first cousins, but their love is hailed as one of the most beautiful royal romances. Victoria and Albert had 9 children. For a queen ruling an empire stretching across 4 continents, this was her most precious political resource. 9 living puzzle pieces to be placed onto the empty squares of the European power map. She arranged marriages for each child with the meticulousness of a master strategist. Viewed from the outside, Victoria's family exuded grandeur and health. There were no deformed jaws like the Habsburgs, no wandering, soulless minds like the Braganzas. But nature always has its own way of testing human pride. What no one knew at the time, a genetic code for hemophilia had quietly existed in her veins, though its origin remains a question science has not fully answered. The code itself might have just been a random biological accident. However, it was the closed, inbreeding marriage system of the European royal network that turned it into a true seed of destruction. Victoria's 4th son and the 8th child in the family, Prince Leopold, was the first confirmed to carry the disease. He bruised from minor bumps, bled incessantly from ordinary wounds, and passed away tragically at the age of 31. 2 of Victoria's daughters carried the recessive gene, silently passing it on without knowing. Through large-scale political marriages, that genetic code spread like an underground spring. It was not loud. It silently crept through generations, stripping away the lives of little princes in Spain, Germany, and especially Russia. See, it inadvertently became the invisible weight crushing the Romanov dynasty's hopes for succession when it struck Alexei, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II, the grandson of Alice, and the great-grandson of Victoria. Alexei's fragility plunged the Russian royal family into despair, paving the way for sinister figures to step into the palace, ultimately contributing to the shaking of the very foundation of the Tsarist throne decades later. Victoria changed the European map of power, not with the smoke and fire of war, not with treaties on paper, but with something no one could see with the naked eye. But what happens if a queen realizes the suffocation of that endogamous dynasty and spends her entire life struggling to break free? Section 9. Elizabeth Sisi of Austria. Returning to the Habsburg dynasty, but in a different century, Elizabeth, affectionately known as Sisi, married Emperor Franz Joseph, her first cousin, when she was just 16. Sisi's portrait, with her cascading long hair and diamond stars pinned to her head, became the symbol of European beauty at the time. But inside the imposing Hofburg Palace, beauty was no privilege. It was a decoration in a glass cage. Franz Joseph loved her, but the Vienna court was a machine operating on archaic courtly rituals from the previous century, where everything was controlled down to the most minute detail. Instead of facing the obvious physical deformities like her ancestors, the soul of the young Bavarian girl fractured from the inside. Suffocated by conservative customs, Sisi realized she was merely a bird stripped of its sky. Unable to fight the throne, Sisi turned to self-defense by strictly controlling her own body. She established incredibly rigorous daily routines, seeking within them a shred of the bodily autonomy the court had stolen from her. Sisi locked herself in loneliness, refusing to participate in ceremonies. and constantly moving across Europe. Over her 60-some years of life, she spent decades living on ships, in temporary rented villas abroad, and on horseback in the remote Hungarian countryside, solely to outrun the phantom of the institution. Ironically, the woman who spent her life running from the court never found a safe harbor in the outside world. On an autumn afternoon in 1898, at the windy Geneva docks, Sisi's final journey ended in tragedy when an anarchist took her life. The attack happened so fast and silently that, at first, no one realized its severity. The corset she habitually wore tight for so many years hid the wound until she collapsed. Sisi's entire life was an escape, and until the very end, she still could not break free. The marriage contracts had once promised to bring eternity to the dynasties. They built fortified walls to hold back enemies. They wove tight, seamless genealogical nets. But they forgot that the fall sometimes does not come from swords on the outside, but is planted right within their own veins. Every end takes a different shape: physical exhaustion, mental darkness, or drops of blood that refuse to stop flowing. But they all begin from the same fear: the fear that power will melt away if shared with the world. Those crowns are still there, resting neatly in museum display cases, cold, silent, with no one left to wear them. After stepping through these 9 dark corners of history, which image haunts you the most? Share it with us in the comments, and we will see you in the next documentary.